Those are my kids, Richard Monroe's voice erupts, slicing through the suffocating silence at his father's funeral. The words are jagged, raw, a declaration of a truth he never saw coming. His eyes fixate on the two young boys standing next to Bella Jackson, the woman he once loved, their faces strikingly familiar, like a mirror reflecting his own. Carter, Mason. The shock hits him like a blow to the chest. How? How had he missed this? How had they existed without him knowing? Bella stands frozen, her gaze steady, but her face betrays years of hidden pain. She holds an envelope in her hand, one that will unravel everything Richard thought he knew about the past. His father's casket is being lowered into the ground, but all Richard can focus on are the boys, his sons. The world spins, and with every passing second, Richard feels the weight of a life built on lies crashing down around him. His mind screams questions. Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you ever reach out? The truth, Richard realizes, is waiting in that envelope, and once it's opened, nothing will ever be the same again. Welcome back, my beautiful family and friends. I've missed you all so much. It's been a tough ride with some technical issues, but by God's grace, we're getting everything back on track. Thank you for sticking with me. Your support means everything. Before we begin, I want to say a little prayer over everyone watching, especially the women. To the women, may God strengthen you, comfort you, and fill your heart with peace and favor. To the men, may God guide you, bless your efforts, and give you wisdom in all you do, and may God's protection rest on every single one of you. Amen. If you're ready for today's story, hit subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. My USA and UK family, I see you. And please watch till the end, because tomorrow I'll be dropping another story you wouldn't want to miss. Now, let's get into the story. The heavy thud of the casket hitting the earth echoed in Richard's chest. His father was gone, buried in the cold, damp ground of Oakwood Cemetery, and all he could think about were the two boys standing across from him, the ones who looked so much like him, Mason and Carter. His sons, his flesh and blood. How had he not known? How had he missed this? The answers were locked away in that damn envelope Bella held. But right now, in the midst of his father's funeral, Richard couldn't bring himself to open it. Instead, his mind spiraled backward to the beginning. The moments that had led him here, standing at the edge of his father's grave, a stranger to his own life. The night had started with all the promise of a new beginning. Richard had just turned 30, his company thriving, his personal life more settled than it had been in years. He had everything: money, success, a future. And in his mind, he had Bella. They were supposed to be it. They were going to build a life together. He had been ready to marry her, ready to start a family. But everything changed when the phone call came. It had been late, too late, and Bella was in tears, desperate, frantic. Her words were a blur, but the few that pierced through the static were clear. "I need you. I need you here." But he hadn't answered. He hadn't been there. The next day, Richard had walked into his penthouse, expecting to find her. Instead, he found Jordan, his younger brother, holding Bella in his arms. She was crying, looking up at Jordan like he was her lifeline, and the image burned itself into Richard's memory. What the hell? He saw it. He didn't need to ask. Bella and Jordan, together, comforting each other. To Richard, it was clear as day. Betrayal. Nothing else could explain it. His own brother in his arms with the woman he loved. His mind spiraled. Anger took root, a dark seed planted by the very thing he feared the most. Being used. His father had spent years drilling it into his head. Trust no one. And Richard had trusted Bella. He had loved her more than anything else. But in that moment, his world turned cold. Richard hadn't stayed for the explanation. He hadn't let Bella speak. He couldn't bear to hear anything that might try to justify it. He stormed out of the apartment, slamming the door behind him. He didn't hear her voice calling after him. He didn't listen. The next few days were a blur of business meetings and late nights in his office. He didn't want to feel, didn't want to process what had happened. He just wanted to bury it, to move on. He shut Bella out, just like he had shut everyone else out when things got hard. But what Richard hadn't realized was that it wasn't just the heartbreak that had blindsided him. It was the lie he had been told about Bella and Jordan. He had let the image of her with his brother define everything. What he didn't know was that Bella had been desperate for him, but he hadn't answered a single one of her calls. She had tried. God, how many times had she tried? Bella had been pregnant, and she had needed him. But when she couldn't reach him, when his calls went straight to voicemail, she had turned to Jordan for comfort. Nothing more. But Richard didn't know that. He never gave her the chance to explain. Richard's father, William Monroe, had always been a powerful influence in his life. Manipulative, calculating, and ruthlessly driven. From the moment Richard was born, William had set the tone for who Richard should be. You don't need friends, son. You need allies. And you don't let anyone get close enough to hurt you. Those words were etched in Richard's mind like a mantra. William had always warned him to trust no one, to never let his emotions cloud his judgment. He'd watched William tear people apart, business rivals, friends, even family, if they dared to get too close. But Richard had always believed he could do better. He could build his empire without playing the same dirty games. He would build it on his own merit. But as Richard stood there at his father's funeral, the weight of William's influence hung over him like a storm cloud. It had been William who had planted the seed of doubt in Richard's mind about Bella. William who had subtly cast suspicions on her background, her family. You know, Richard, there's always a risk when you mix business with pleasure. His father's voice had a way of making every word feel like a truth that couldn't be argued with. And so, when Richard saw Bella with Jordan, his mind jumped to conclusions. He didn't need the full story. He didn't need to hear her side. His father had already filled him with enough poison to make him doubt her love, to make him doubt himself. It had been easier, simpler, to believe that she had betrayed him, that his father was right, that everyone was after something. Richard had never questioned his decision to shut Bella out. At the time, it had seemed like the only choice. She had broken his trust. The pain of losing her was easier to bear if he could convince himself that he was the one in control. He could move on. He had to. But now, standing at his father's funeral, the truth started to seep in, slow and unrelenting. His father, William Monroe, had orchestrated everything. He had manipulated Richard into thinking the worst about Bella. And all these years, Richard had been living a lie. What hurt the most was the realization that his father's manipulation had affected everything. His family, his business, even his relationship with Jordan. His father had spent years driving wedges between people, turning allies into enemies, and creating chaos in his wake. Richard had been the puppet, not the puppeteer. And now, standing in the rain with the truth staring him in the face, Richard had to confront everything he had done, everything he had lost. Bella, Jordan, the boys, Mason and Carter. He had to face the man his father had forced him to become. Richard's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind him. He turned to see Jordan approaching, his face unreadable. The tension between them was thick, a wall that had been built over years of miscommunication and betrayal. But in that moment, Richard knew the truth. And it wasn't just about Bella and Jordan. It was about the life he had built. A life built on the lies of a man who wasn't just his father, but the architect of his own downfall. The storm inside him was far from over, but for the first time, Richard could see the cracks in the wall, and he knew deep down that he had to face them before they consumed him whole. The rain continued to fall, soaking everything in its path. But Richard couldn't move, couldn't leave. He was rooted to the spot, waiting for the next revelation, the next truth to come crashing down on him. As Richard struggles to process the enormity of the truth, and as the rain falls harder, take a moment to reflect on how we sometimes let misunderstandings tear us apart. Imagine if we had just listened, just heard each other before it was too late. If you believe in second chances, in healing old wounds, subscribe now. This story isn't just about a CEO and his family. It's about all of us, learning to forgive, to grow, to make things right. The funeral service had ended, but the heaviness in the air refused to lift. Richard stood at the edge of his father's grave, his eyes still lingering on the two boys beside Bella, his mind swirling with 1,000 questions. Bella hadn't moved. She stood quietly, watching him, her hands trembling ever so slightly as she held the envelope. Richard's pulse quickened as Bella approached him. The rain had slowed to a steady drizzle, the sky overcast and unforgiving, just like the storm raging inside him. She stopped a few feet away, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Bella's expression was unreadable, but the weight in her eyes told him she knew what this moment meant. She knew what had been buried for 7 years. Without a word, Bella extended the envelope toward him. His father's name, William Monroe, was scrawled across the front in a hurried hand as if it had been written in haste. The paper felt cold in Richard's fingers as he took it. For a long moment, he stood there, staring at it. The realization hit him like a slap across the face. This wasn't just a letter. This was a piece of the puzzle he had been trying to ignore, a key to understanding the past that had eluded him for so long. Richard tore the envelope open, his hands shaking. As he unfolded the letter, his heart sank, the words on the page seeming to blur as the rain mixed with the salt of his own sweat. It wasn't just an ordinary letter. It was the final will and testament of William Monroe. He skimmed through the legal jargon until his eyes landed on the clause that made his stomach drop. To my sons, Richard and Jordan Monroe, I leave the entirety of my estate with one condition. You must reconcile and work together on the Alexandria development, a project I have long planned but never completed. If you are unable to collaborate on this venture within 6 months, the estate will be donated to charity and all assets will be liquidated. The decision rests with you both. Richard's mind reeled. The Alexandria's development, the project his father had mentioned countless times, a sprawling real estate venture on the edge of the city, worth millions. William had wanted it to be the crown jewel of his empire. but it had never come to fruition. The idea of the project alone had fueled so many of Richard's dreams, but to be forced to work with Jordan, the brother he hadn't spoken to in years, was an insult. It was a game, a trap designed by William to force him and Jordan back together. And then there was Bella. Richard's eyes flickered back to her, still standing silently, waiting. This letter wasn't just about his father's will. It was a final move by William, a chess game to manipulate his sons into doing his bidding, reconciling, working together, or losing everything. The inheritance wasn't the only thing at stake. His entire life, his family, the broken pieces of his past, all of it was wrapped up in this moment. Richard swallowed hard, his throat tightening as he struggled to breathe. The weight of the envelope felt suffocating in his hands. His father had always controlled everything from behind the scenes, but this was beyond manipulation. It was a final, twisted test, a choice that would forever change the course of his life. "What does it mean?" Bella's voice was barely a whisper, yet it cut through the silence like a knife. Richard didn't answer right away. He simply stared at the letter, the words swimming before his eyes. "What do I do now?" The rain continued to fall, relentless, as Bella waited, her own heart heavy with the burden of secrets long kept. Richard was left to face the man who had shaped him even in death, and to decide whether he would play the game or finally break free. Richard's mind was still spinning as he stuffed the letter back into the envelope, trying to make sense of the will. The weight of his father's manipulation felt like a vice around his chest. But just as he turned to leave the cemetery, a voice cut through the air, sharp and familiar. "Richard." It was Jordan. The tension between the two brothers was palpable, thick and suffocating, as they stood face to face for the first time in years. Richard's eyes flickered over Jordan, his younger brother, now 30, standing in front of him with that all-too-familiar look of someone who had been carrying a heavy burden. But Richard didn't care. All he saw was betrayal. The same image burned into his mind since the night he walked in on Bella and Jordan together. "Don't pretend like you give a damn," Richard said coldly, his voice low but full of venom. "You and Bella? What the hell was that all about?" Jordan stiffened, the muscles in his jaw tightening. "You don't get it, do you?" "No," Richard shot back, stepping closer, a fierce anger bubbling beneath the surface. "I don't get it. I saw what I saw. You were with her. You think I'm just going to forget that?" Jordan's face darkened, the hurt in his eyes becoming more apparent. "You didn't give me a chance to explain, Richard. You never let me. You never even asked." Richard took a step back, thrown by the raw emotion in his brother's voice. "Explain what? How you and her—" "No," Jordan interrupted, shaking his head. "It wasn't like that. It never was." His voice cracked, a mixture of frustration and pain leaking through. "I wasn't with her, Richard. She was grieving. You shut her out when she needed you the most. She tried to reach you. 17 times Bella tried to call you. And every time you ignored her, pushed her away. I was just there for her, just comforting her." The words hit Richard like a slap across the face. His stomach twisted in a way he didn't expect. The cold anger that had clouded his judgment for years began to crack. His mind raced, replaying the night he saw them together. He had assumed so much, but the weight of those assumptions had kept him blind to the truth. Bella wasn't mine to control, mine to fix. She was hurting. She was alone. Richard's voice faltered. the words hard to find. He took a deep breath, fighting to keep himself from crumbling. I thought you and her, I thought you betrayed me. His chest tightened with shame as he looked away. Richard, listen to me, Jordan said, his voice softer now. I didn't betray you. I never would. But you didn't trust me enough to ask. You just cut us both out. Richard stood there, frozen, torn between guilt and anger. All these years, he had been so certain, so sure of the story he'd told himself. And now, Bella and Jordan, both of them, had been victims of his own pride. I should have been there for her, Richard said quietly, barely a whisper. His mind swirled with the realization of how much he had lost, not just Bella, but his brother too. The rift between them was his fault, his pride, his failure to listen. Jordan's gaze softened. And now you're standing here, blaming me for everything that went wrong, but you're the one who made the decision. You cut us both off. You left us to pick up the pieces of your mess. The words stung, but Richard couldn't deny the truth in them. He had built walls around himself, around his pain, and in doing so, he'd broken the very people he loved. I'm sorry, Richard said, his voice breaking for the first time. I should have believed you. Jordan let out a shaky breath, his shoulders sagging as the tension in his body began to release. I know, but it's not just about what you should have done. It's about fixing this. We have to fix this, Richard, before it's too late. The weight of his brother's words pressed heavily on Richard's chest. The finality of the situation hit him hard. He couldn't undo the past, but maybe, just maybe, he could rebuild. Maybe he could rebuild with Bella. Maybe there was still a chance for the future, for the family he'd thought he'd lost. But first, he had to face the man he had been, and the man he was becoming. Bella's face flashed in Richard's mind. His heart ached, realizing how wrong he had been, how much time he had wasted. But as Jordan's words echoed in his ears, Richard knew he couldn't afford to waste any more. Not now. Not after everything. Richard stood alone in the pouring rain, staring at his father's grave, the weight of his legacy, pressing down on him. Even now, in death, William Monroe controlled everything. His influence was suffocating, still affecting Richard in ways he couldn't fully understand. The man was dead, but his shadow lingered, long and dark, clouding every decision Richard had made over the last 7 years. As Richard's mind drifted, the memories of his father's manipulative words resurfaced, sharp, calculating, always aimed at controlling every aspect of Richard's life. It had started early, planted like seeds in the soil of his childhood. Trust no one, Richard. William's voice echoed in his memory, cold and unwavering, just as it had been when Richard was 15. They sat in the study, the thick oak of the desk between them, the dim light casting shadows over William's sharp features. The world is full of people looking to take from you. Everyone has a motive. William's gaze was like steel, cutting straight through Richard. Especially women. They're after something, whether it's money or status. And Bella, she's no different. Be careful. Richard remembered how those words had lodged themselves in his mind like a splinter, working their way deep into his subconscious. Over the years, he'd dismissed them at times, but they never fully left. Every time Bella had come close, Richard heard his father's voice again, whispering doubts. Is she really who she says she is? What does she want from you? Now, standing at his father's grave, Richard couldn't deny the truth. William had spent his life building walls between Richard and everyone he cared about. His father had cultivated distrust in Richard's heart, not just toward Bella, but toward the entire world. William had poisoned his mind with the idea that love was a weakness, that loyalty could be bought, that power was the only thing that truly mattered. Richard's heart twisted with guilt. How had he not seen it before? How had he allowed his father's influence to dictate his relationships, his choices, his life? He had pushed Bella away, shut out his brother, and distanced himself from everyone who had ever tried to get close. All because he had believed his father's lies. And now it was all unraveling. The people who had cared for him were no longer in his life, and the empire he had built so carefully and meticulously felt empty. It was all built on a foundation of manipulation and mistrust. His father's death should have been a moment of liberation, but instead it felt like the weight of 1,000 years of control crashing down on him. The battle wasn't over. Richard knew he had to make a choice, one that would define who he was going to become. He could either continue living in his father's shadow, forever playing the same game, or he could walk away, finally free of the lies. Richard's gaze turned to the envelope in his hand, the letter, the will, his father's final attempt to control him. Richard took a long, steadying breath. The legacy of William Monroe had shaped him, but it didn't have to define him. The storm raged around him, but Richard was no longer afraid to face it. Imagine living a life where you trust the wrong people and push away the ones who truly care. Richard is learning that the hard way. If you feel for him, for the people who've been hurt by family secrets, subscribe to see what happens next in his journey. This is a story we all can relate to. The rain had finally stopped, leaving behind a damp, heavy silence that seemed to cling to everything. Richard found himself standing beside Bella on the porch of a small cottage on the outskirts of the cemetery grounds. Her eyes were distant, like she was searching for something buried deep within the past. Richard had never seen her like this before, vulnerable but resolute. "I didn't want it to end like this." Bella's voice was quiet, the words barely audible, but Richard could feel the weight behind them. He had been bracing himself for anger, for accusations, but instead her voice trembled with something far more powerful, the pain of 7 years of silence, of rejection. "I know you didn't," Richard said, his throat tight. "I didn't either, but He paused, his chest heavy with the guilt that had been building since the moment he saw her standing there at the funeral, holding those 2 boys, his sons. "I tried to reach you," Bella continued, her eyes not meeting his. 17 times, Richard. I left messages. I wrote you letters. I showed up at your office, at your apartment. I called, and you never answered. Not once." Her voice broke on the last word, the quiet sob in her throat making Richard wince. "I thought you had chosen him," Richard said, his voice low, almost like he was talking to himself. "Finn, I thought that you and my brother—" "No, Richard," she interrupted, her voice steady now, though the hurt was still there. "There was never anything between me and Finn. Not like that. I was alone. You shut me out. You turned your back on me when I needed you most. And when you wouldn't listen, when you kept pushing me away, I turned to Jordan. He was the only one who was there when I needed someone." Richard's heart twisted. He had spent all these years convinced of a betrayal that never existed. Bella wasn't the one who had broken their relationship. It had been him closing himself off, shutting her out because of a mistake, an assumption. "Why didn't you tell me?" His voice was raw now, desperate for answers. "Why didn't you tell me you were pregnant? That you were carrying my children?" He could feel the tears rising in his eyes, the frustration and regret clawing at him. Bella's face softened, but there was a sadness in her eyes that Richard couldn't ignore. "I wanted to. I tried, Richard, but you were so unreachable. I was scared. I had no idea how to tell you, how to explain. And then, when I found out I was pregnant, I felt like I couldn't reach you anymore." She paused, her gaze falling to the ground as she collected herself. Richard felt the sting of her words. He had been the one who built the walls, the one who pushed her away. And now, standing here with her, those walls were crumbling, revealing the painful truth. Bella took a deep breath and continued, her voice trembling but strong. "And then your father, William, he came to me after I told him I was pregnant. He offered me money, a lot of money, to disappear, to never contact you again, to leave you, to leave us." Richard's breath hitched. "He what?" Bella nodded. "He said I wasn't good enough for you, that I was a distraction, that I should take the money and leave, that you'd be better off without me. And I almost took it, Richard. I almost left. But then I realized something. If I left, I'd be giving up everything. I'd be abandoning the life I had with you. I couldn't do that. So I said no, and I left the city." The weight of her words pressed down on Richard. He had never known how far his father had gone to manipulate the situation, how deep the divide had been, or how much pain his own actions had caused Bella. "And the boys?" Richard asked, his voice barely a whisper. Bella's face softened as she spoke of them, a warmth creeping into her eyes, despite the sadness. "Mason and Carter. They grew up with me, without you, without the man they deserved to know. But I always told them about you, Richard. I told them how much their father would have loved them, how you would have held them, just like you held them in your heart before everything fell apart. They knew who you were, even if you didn't know them." Richard's heart shattered as the truth hit him like a wave. His sons had been growing up without him, without knowing their father, without feeling his love. They had lived their whole lives with a part of him missing, and it was his fault. He wanted to reach out, to hold her, to apologize, but he knew it was too late for that. The damage had been done, and no words could undo the years of hurt. "I'm so sorry, Bella," Richard whispered, his voice breaking, "for everything, for believing the lies, for pushing you away, for being a coward." She finally looked at him then, her eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and something else. Something he couldn't name. "It's not too late, Richard. It doesn't have to be. But you have to decide who you want to be now." Richard nodded slowly, knowing that for the first time in years, the weight of his past was no longer a chain holding him back. There was a chance, however slim, to make things right. But it would take more than apologies. It would take action. And for the first time in a long time, Richard was ready to fight for the family he had lost. The tension between Richard and Jordan was thick enough to cut with a knife as they stood side by side in the conference room, their eyes locked in a silent battle. The weight of their father's will hung over them, an unspoken reminder that they were being forced to work together, to rebuild something neither of them had the will to fix. Richard's gaze drifted over the plans for the Alexandria development, a sprawling real estate project that had been their father's dream, and now a battleground for them both. He felt the familiar rush of anger and frustration building inside him. Working with Jordan, after everything that had happened, was the last thing he wanted. But it wasn't just about the project. It was about the years they had lost, the hurt that still festered between them. Jordan was at the head of the table, his fingers tapping the surface in a rhythm that Richard found maddening. His younger brother's presence was a constant reminder of everything that had gone wrong. The betrayal Richard had assumed was real, the walls he had built between them. But as much as Richard hated to admit it, the reality was different. Jordan hadn't betrayed him. He had simply been there when Richard hadn't been. Jordan looked up, meeting Richard's eyes. "We need to make a decision on the budget for the infrastructure." His voice was cool, detached. "But it's hard to do that when you're still holding on to all this old crap." Richard stiffened. "Old crap?" The words were sharp, bitter. "You think I'm still holding on to old crap?" His voice rose in frustration. "I thought you were my brother, Jordan. But you went behind my back. You were with her. You didn't." "No," Jordan interrupted, his voice quieter now but firm. "I was comforting her. You think I wanted to be the one caught in the middle of that? I didn't ask for any of it. But you shut us both out. You pushed me away." Richard's jaw tightened. The words stung, but they were true. He had been the one to pull the trigger on their relationship, to sever the bond between them with a decision made in anger, without ever hearing the truth. "I should have trusted you," Richard muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Jordan leaned back in his chair, the tension in his body easing ever so slightly. "Yeah, you should have. But you didn't. And we're paying the price for that now." Richard ran a hand over his face. The weight of the situation, of the past, pressed down on him harder than ever. He looked at Jordan, his younger brother, the man he once called his best friend, and realized just how much he had lost. How much he still stood to lose if he didn't fix this. He had spent so many years chasing success, building an empire on his own terms, that he had forgotten what really mattered. The people he loved, the people who loved him. The Alexandria development wasn't just a project. It was a crossroads, a test, a chance for Richard to decide what kind of man he wanted to be. Did he want to continue living in the shadow of his father's legacy, locked in a battle with his brother? Or did he want to build something new, something real? Did he want to repair the broken parts of his life, including his relationship with Bella? Was it too late for redemption? His mind swirled with doubt. What if it was too late? We've all made mistakes. We've all let pride destroy relationships we never thought we'd lose. Richard is at a crossroads, and so are we. Don't miss the chance to see how he decides to move forward. Subscribe now to be part of this journey toward redemption. The hum of construction equipment filled the air as Richard and Jordan stood side by side on the site of the Alexandria development, the sprawling project that had once been their father's dream. Now it was a testament to everything Richard had to rebuild, not just the family empire, but the fractured relationships that had nearly torn them apart. For the first time in years, the tension between Richard and Jordan had started to ease. They still had moments of friction, but those moments were growing fewer, pushed aside by the urgency of the work before them. Richard couldn't ignore the weight of their shared history, but each decision they made together, no matter how small, was a step forward, a step toward healing. "We'll need to redo the zoning for the commercial section," Jordan said, flipping through a set of architectural plans, his tone more businesslike now than before. The city's pushing for more mixed-use space, so we can't keep it strictly office buildings. The residential units need to be reworked too. Richard nodded, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the clipboard in his hands. They had spent countless hours going over the blueprints, deciding where every square foot of space would go, how to balance the demands of the city and their investors. It wasn't easy, but for the first time, it felt like they were moving in the right direction, not just in business, but in their relationship as brothers. "I'll have the team adjust the plans," Richard said, meeting Jordan's eyes. There was an unspoken understanding between them now. No words were needed. As they worked through the details, Richard's mind kept drifting back to Bella, to the boys, to everything that had been left unsaid for far too long. The days he'd spent avoiding the truth had left deep scars. But now, as he and Jordan found common ground, he realized how much he had been running from, how much he had lost, not just in his business empire, but in his family. That evening, after a long day on the site, Richard found himself back at the small office they had set up for the project, the glow of his laptop screen lighting up his tired face. Bella's words from their conversation earlier that week played on a loop in his mind. "I couldn't stay, Richard," she had said, her voice heavy with emotion. "You didn't hear me. You didn't see me. Your father had already planted the seeds of doubt in your mind about me. You thought I was using you." Richard had recoiled at the truth in her words. He had spent years believing the worst, manipulated by the very man who was supposed to protect him. William had poisoned everything, including the love he had once shared with Bella. Richard leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting to the window, where the lights of the city flickered in the distance. The world was changing. He could feel it. The legacy of his father, once a weight he couldn't escape, was slowly losing its grip on him. He could see a future now, one that didn't revolve around the toxic control his father had wielded over every aspect of his life. As the work on the Alexandria development continued, Richard knew this project was more than just a building. It was a symbol, a chance to forge a new path, to build something lasting not just for himself, but for his sons, Mason and Carter, who deserved to know the truth. He wasn't going to let his father's legacy define him anymore. He had his family, his business, and now, with the chance to rebuild his relationship with Bella, he had the opportunity to create something he could truly be proud of. The path wasn't easy, but for the first time in years, Richard believed in it. He believed in them. The sun was setting over Washington, D.C., casting long shadows across the skyline as Richard drove down the familiar streets. The city had always been a symbol of his success, his empire, his wealth, the legacy his father had forced upon him. But now, as he neared the small house on the edge of town, he realized the city held something far more important: his future. He had been a fool, letting pride, anger, and fear dictate the course of his life. He had shut Bella out. He had closed his heart to the possibility of a family. And worse than anything, he had abandoned the one thing that had always mattered more than anything else: love. But tonight, he was ready to change that, ready to face the truth. When Richard walked into the house, the soft sound of laughter hit him first. Mason and Carter were sitting at the kitchen table, their faces lit up by the glow of a small lamp. Bella was sitting with them, a gentle smile on her face as she helped them with their homework. Richard stopped in the doorway, taking it all in. His heart swelled with emotions he didn't know how to process. For years, he had thought of himself as someone who could control everything, his business, his life, his emotions. But as he watched the scene before him, he realized how wrong he had been. He had never truly understood what mattered. Bella looked up from the table, her eyes meeting his. She hadn't expected him, not tonight. But when she saw the look in his eyes, raw, vulnerable, she stood up slowly, as if unsure of what was coming. "I'm sorry," Richard's voice cracked. He could barely get the words out, but they had been waiting on his lips for so long. "I've been an idiot, a fool. I pushed you away when all you ever did was love me. I didn't see it. I didn't want to see it." Bella's breath caught, her hand instinctively reaching out to him. "Richard." "No," he interrupted, taking a step toward her. "I need to say this. I was wrong about everything. About you. About us. And I've spent so many years telling myself I had to prove something. But the truth is, I don't have to prove anything anymore. I just want to be with you. I want to be a father to them." He gestured toward Mason and Carter, who were watching him quietly now, their innocent eyes filled with curiosity. Mason, the older of the two, looked at Richard with a mix of hope and hesitation. "Are you really going to stay, Dad?" Richard's heart shattered as the word Dad echoed in the room. He crouched down to their level, his voice gentle but steady. "Yes, I'm going to stay. I'm going to be here for both of you." Tears welled up in Bella's eyes as she took a step forward. "You don't have to say it, Richard. I've waited so long. But I know what's in your heart. I see it now." He stood up, looking at her with a mixture of regret and hope. "I've spent so much time trying to fix everything, trying to control it. But the truth is, I don't want to fix things on my own anymore. I want to build something real. With you. With Mason and Carter. I want to build a family." And for the first time, Bella smiled. Not just the polite smile she had given him over the years, but a smile full of warmth, of hope. "Then let's build it together." As the evening wore on, Richard sat at the table with Bella and the boys, laughing and talking like they had never been apart. It felt like the first real family dinner he had ever had. He had missed so much. Years of birthdays, first steps, small moments that had slipped away while he had been too focused on the wrong things. But tonight, he was finally where he needed to be. Home. A family. His family. Sometimes the hardest thing is admitting where we've gone wrong. Richard found a way back to his family. What about you? Do you think it's too late to fix things? If this story spoke to you, if it resonated in any way, subscribe and see what happens next. Because sometimes redemption is just the beginning. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.